Thank you, everyone, for listening to Soul Talk with host Jeremy McDonald, the author of Peace Be Still. You can check out more about our shows or about Jeremy at soultalkradio.org and jeremymcdonald.net. And now for our show.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for listening to Soul Talk. We have a great guest coming on the line. He's a best-selling author of 12 books, including Life After Life, which has sold over 13 million copies worldwide in reunions, as well as numerous articles in academic and professional literature. Dr. Moody, as our guest tonight, continues to capture enormous public interest and generate controversy with his groundbreaking work on near-death experiences and what happens when we die. We're going to welcome Dr. Moody on the show here just very briefly. His website is www.lifeafterlife.com, and we're going to bring him on the line right now. Hello, Dr. Moody. How are you?
Fine. How are you, Jeremy? Thank you so much for having me on the program tonight.
Well, thank you for coming on. I know it's been a couple of years since you were on the show.
It has been. I remember it well. It's great to hear from you again.
Absolutely. So I was just introducing you on the show and giving your websites and everything. And callers, when you call in tonight, you can call in at 646-929-1371. Please be patient because I'm sure we're going to be covering quite a bit of ground and topics here. And Dr. Moody, I'd like to actually, because I think the last time you were on, your book, your memoirs just come out, The Paranormal.
Yes.
And I have had the opportunity to read it since then, and would like to cover a little bit on that, if you don't mind. And
sure, yeah.
I actually, one of the things I found very, very, very interesting, I thought it was the most wonderful story, is the time when you were young in Georgia, and your father was off at war, and I remember you describing all the women that loved you, and that in the small town, and like that. So I just thought that was a really remarkable story.
To this day, yes. Still spoiled by that, yes, sir. Yep, I was. My dad went away to World War II on literally the day I was born, and he got to see me for a few minutes and then off, and then didn't come back until I was a year and a half old. And in the meantime, I got spoiled by wonderful grandparents, and all the people who were left in Porterdale were mostly women at that time, you know. So, yeah, I did have a very spoiled childhood. I did. It's true.
I thought it was cute because everybody always called me an only child growing up because I was raised by one woman who was a hospice nurse and was very spoiled, so I just kind of related to that story. So the other question I wanted to kind of talk to you about in that book is this: I didn't know this until I actually read that book, that you've actually experienced a near-death experience yourself and a shared death experience, but it was after you wrote Life After Life. Am I correct?
That's right. And I have a disease called Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and I had it without ever being aware of it. I guess. Well, let's put it this way. I had 2 doctoral degrees before I was 31, a PhD in philosophy and an MD, and 3 of those years I had been a philosophy professor, and I can tell you at age 70, which I am now, you realize there's something really terribly wrong with somebody who would have 2 doctoral degrees before they were 31. And definitely that was wrong with me. Namely, I just spent my life with my nose in a book, and that's how I've been mostly all my life. But this time where I came close to death, I did, but I don't know whether to call it a near-death experience or not. Well, I didn't have the classical thing of getting out of your body and so on, but I did. What I can say that I experienced was definitely a switchover, almost like from this plane or domain of reality that we're in to something that is, I won't say on top of this that make it sounds like it's something superior or something. No, it's not like that. It's just like the analogy I used is that it's like you suddenly realize being on a stage or something, or like in a theater, and you see the scenery move, right? Well, that was kind of what it was like. I didn't get out of my body or see the light or see these other things people talk about. But what I like to say is I got close enough to see the city limit sign. And that was, let's see, in 1989, I think, or so. I can't remember exactly. But what I did realize from that is that I got a little bit of almost there to what I hear from patients all the time. And Jeremy, in terms of my background, that is significant in the sense that I just was not raised in any sort of religious environment. At Porterdale, Georgia was where I was born, and of course, the Deep South is full of religious people and stuff, but I just kind of escaped that. What I imagine happened is that my dad was a surgeon and a professional military officer and served in the Pacific Theater in World War II. Well, we know that generation didn't talk, right? So Dad never really talked about it, but just as I've grown up, I kind of surmised figured out that he must have seen such horrific things in World War II that even though he didn't discuss it when he got back home, it was just religion to him was just not a starter. And I remember him sometimes making kind of sarcastic, I guess, or maybe that's a little harsh, but the way he talked about religion just made me realize that he didn't think much of it. Plus, my mother's mother was this very humorous person who was always kind of making offhand jokes, but in a very kind-hearted way about religious people. I mean, it was kind of like she thought that they were kind of childlike or something. And so that was my attitude. And so I got interested in astronomy when I was 7 or 8, and I made up my mind pretty quickly that what death was all about was, well, your body dies, and your consciousness, I assumed, went to zero. I mean, I just never even thought about it. And so that's the whole idea of an afterlife to me was just something I knew basically from cartoons, and so then I went to the University of Virginia at age 18 with the intention to study astronomy and get my PhD in astronomy, but I had gotten interested a little bit in philosophy in high school due to a great high school teacher I had. And when I got to UVA, I took a philosophy course, and I got hooked. And we studied Plato, and it was at the end of Plato's book, The Republic, reading that I first encountered this notion of a near-death experience, because Plato wrote about a warrior who had been believed on the battlefield, but spontaneously revived, and told the story of getting away from his body and going through a passageway into another world where he saw his life in review and so on. And that was impressive. I mean, anybody who's ever read The Republic remembers that kind of just amazing scene in there at the end. And so in talking about this with my philosophy professor, what I found out was that these early Greek philosophers studied cases of people who were said to have died and come back, and they called them the revenants. And another name that people have probably heard is Democritus, who was also a great ancient Greek philosopher who lived about the same time as Plato. And he was the first atomist, like he thought that everything was made of atoms. And he looked at this, he talked about these stories too and wrote about them, but he said that, well, it's just the brain winding down, in effect, was his idea, and there's no reality to it. Well, here we are, it's 2,300 years later, and we're still debating this question they raised so beautifully back 2,300 years ago, is, are these experiences Do they reflect an afterlife, or is it just something going on in the brain? And see, I didn't have any sort of background to put this into. So basically, I'd studied this in the ancient Greeks. And then in 1965, 3 years later, one of my philosophy professors told me that Dr. George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry there at the university, had had such an experience. So in 1965, I heard about this experience from George Ritchie, and that was the first time, and subsequent to that, I have interviewed literally thousands of people from all over the world who went to the brink of death and were revived and had these astonishing stories to tell. And I always realized that these people were sincere, that was plain. But I just didn't know whether they were life after death or not. It never really, I never really put much stock on that notion that it's, the brain winding down, because people just love to say as a way of, so they won't really have to think about these things, that, it's just the oxygen cut off to the brain creating a hallucinatory episode. But I always knew that wasn't true, because back in 1972, I talked to one of my own professors of medicine who had such an experience, not when she almost died, but when her mother died. And this physician was trying unsuccessfully, as it turned out, to resuscitate her mother, who had a sudden cardiac arrest. But she told me that when her mother died, that she herself, the doctor, felt herself get out of her body and watch the now deceased body of her mother down below, seeing her own physical body, seeing her mother there with her now in spirit form, seeing her mother sort of recede into this beautiful light and being greeted by loved ones of hers who had already died. And so you see, if the bystanders, and that was the first I've heard, but now hundreds and hundreds of them, of people who just happened to be there at the bedside when somebody else died. And even though they were not ill or injured, they tell us that as the person in the bed died, that they themselves, the bystanders, have all of these things that we talk about being a near-death experience, like seeing something leave the body of the dying person, which they describe as a kind of light or form. Sometimes actually getting out of their bodies themselves and accompanying their dying loved ones part way toward this light. Sometimes seeing apparitions of the dying person's relatives who have died come into the room as though to escort them away. And incredibly, Jeremy, cases where people there at the bedside have told me that as their loved one usually, but in some cases their patient. I had a doctor not long ago who told me about this. He was called to the ER to see a patient he didn't even know to resuscitate this guy. And what these people say is that as the person dies, that they empathically co-live the dying life review of the person. So, I think the people who tell you that this is just brain damage or that it's something neurophysiological going on in the mind, what that signifies to me is that they are very frightened by this information in some way, that, they just can't compute it, so they just don't want to think about it. And they say, oh, it's the brain acting up. Well, again, if it's the brain acting up because of oxygen deprivation, why do people who are standing around who are not ill or injured have this same kind of experience when somebody dies? So I think that we've got a real mystery here.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're as I told you in the beginning, my mother was a hospice nurse, and she said
yes,
she saw many times the patient's spirit come out of their body, and it was because of her work that when she passed, it was very easy for me to. Of course, I've gone through the grief, and I've actually been in a psychomantium, incidentally, because a friend of mine.
Oh, yeah, good.
So, but I think that, it is something that the world is not paying attention to. But do you think that it's starting to change? I mean, with your work and with Eben Alexander coming forward, and Mary Neal coming forward.
It is absolutely changing, Jeremy. And if in the United States the medical journals, the American medical journals, are rated in this fashion. Number one is the New England Journal of Medicine, which is just a terrific medical journal. And then it goes down, and at number 5, which is a very respectable showing, is the journal called Missouri Medicine. And Missouri Medicine is the medical journal, obviously, of the Missouri Medical Association. And, Jeremy, they are in the midst now of an 18-month series of articles by medical doctors who have either had near-death experiences themselves or who have studied near-death experiences among their patients. And it's just really horrific. I mean, terrific to me. I can't, it's like these doctors in there are saying, one of the most recent ones is this wonderful seeming man who's a professor of orthopedic surgery somewhere in New York. It's upstate New York. I forget which university, but in this journal article, he's sort of talking. This is basically what he says. He says, I was hit by lightning and I died, and then with this attitude that, I got to say this because it's true. He says, and there's life after death. And similarly, a dermatologist recently who wrote the same thing about her near-death experience, and there is a really amazing case now. Dr. Rajiv, R-A-G-I-V, Parti, P-A-R-T-I, is chief of anesthesiology at the Bakersfield, California Heart Hospital, who had just a phenomenal near-death experience. And this is going to be, pretty soon, I think, this next few months, his book is coming out about this. So you are absolutely right when you say that this does seem to be loosening up. I mean, I guess basically, you see, there are just so many people that we're bringing back from the state that when I went to medical school, we would have just called it death and sent them to the morgue. But now we can bring people back from increasingly more death-like states. And what we continue to find is they are hauled back from these really seemingly impossible situations. You mentioned Eben Alexander, who's my dear friend, and I've talked to the priest, for example, the Episcopal priest who was there when Eben almost died, and other people. And what do you say about this? These things are just very difficult to put in a box. And from our encounters with each other, I am a skeptic. These people who use that word skeptic, it's by the very word the way they use it, they prove that they're not skeptics, because apparently they're not even skeptical enough to get up, waddle out of their chair to waddle over to the dictionary to see what it means. But I'll say what it means because I am a skeptic. And the skeptical movement of ancient Greek philosophy was formed by a wonderful philosopher named Pyrrho of Athens, Pyrrho. And Pyrrho, to date him for you, came along about, 20 years after the death of Aristotle. Well, one of Aristotle's great accomplishments was that he codified logic, and it's the logic that you and I are using right now as we are talking, and that our listeners are using as they're trying to make sense of what we're saying. And that logic was established by the time of Pyrrho. So he knew about logic. He said, well, all right. And you know what a logic is? It's a set of rules and procedures for teaching us how to draw a conclusion from premises. But what Pyrrho thought about, knowing logic, he said, well, okay, but what if we don't draw the conclusion? And that's what being a skeptic is. And the reason they did this, they even had manuals to tell you how to, not draw conclusions. Like, don't draw a conclusion that's a desk there. It could be a cardboard cutout or a optical illusion or a holographic projection or whatever. But the point is, just don't draw the conclusion. And they found that if they followed this assiduously, that two things would happen. Number one, it really is a mind-expanding experience to be a skeptic if you practice it. And then also they found that since everybody else was rushing in the same direction to get to the conclusion that their idea was, well, let's just hold back and don't draw a conclusion, but continue to do our inquiry. And then what they realize, is that since everybody else is focused in one direction on the conclusion, but if you're avoiding a conclusion, then you see like little side pathways of inquiry that nobody else went down because they were thinking about getting to the conclusion. So now if you read that back, see what those so-called skeptics who know nothing of what it means tell you something like, well, I'm a skeptic. I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. Well, if you unpack what that person just said, what they said is, well, I'm a person who doesn't draw conclusions, and my conclusion is such and such. And the fact is, most of these people who call themselves skeptics are just entertainers. I mean, there's one some sort of blowhard, I forget his name, who, calls himself a skeptic. Well, he's so uneducated he can't even use the English language. But, he's representing a great philosophical movement, so it's not true. Being a skeptic is a good thing. And so what I found from my skeptical inquiry is that I reached a point, Jeremy, about 3 years ago where I give up. Like I can't figure out anymore how to not draw the conclusion that there's an afterlife. And let me explain how this came about. I met an artist who had a very profound near-death experience when he was in a car crash which killed his wife. And basically I encouraged him to write his story up. Well, he did, but then when he wrote the book, he realized he needed to mention the name of the doctor who saved his life, and patients typically don't tell their doctors about this. So anyway, he called the doctor and asked him to come to lunch, and when he came, he told the doctor about his near-death experience. And then the doctor became very solemn and said, well, I never told anybody this, but that night you came into the hospital, I knew you weren't going to die because I talked to your wife, and see, his wife had been killed in the accident. So at that point, I just said, well, it's just very hard to dismiss this, you see, when the bystanders and the person who almost dies agree on the details like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It brings it together. It's interesting. The word skeptic. You brought that to light for me when I saw you lecture in St. Petersburg. Well, it was about 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
And you brought up the word skeptic, and I was like, well, a skeptic is somebody that asks questions and deeper questions.
That's right.
And
exactly.
So I thought, I'm a skeptic. And the other thing you brought up in your book is that I never realized this, that metaphysical studies are a philosophy discipline, and I thought.
Oh yes, absolutely. The Aristotle didn't use the word metaphysics, but he was responsible for it because after his death, his editors were trying to get all his manuscripts together, which were both mostly his lecture notes. Apparently, mostly what we have of Aristotle is his lecture notes. He was a terrific popular writer, but his popular books kind of disappeared, and we only have his lecture notes. But they were putting all this stuff together, and some of the manuscripts had obvious, like this one would be biology, right, or this one would be psychology or whatever. And then they had one, the physics was the last one they had, but then they had this other manuscript that it was something kind of beyond physics or even beyond that. So they called it the metaphysics or the beyond physics. So, yeah, that's where that word comes from. And metaphysics it's one of the branches of philosophy, metaphysics being the study of the ultimate principles of reality, like what is reality, the difference between reality and illusion, and so on. And then the other branches are like logic and epistemology and ethics and so on. But that's right. Metaphysics is a philosophical discipline. It is, yeah.
I just thought it was really interesting because when we study the things that you teach and that you've done research on and many other realms that other scientists and philosophers have been studying for years, sometimes we can get lost in it and lose our skepticism or our logic, which grounds us, and keeps us in the difference of what is illusion. So I thought it was really
that's what. Yeah. I'm very early in life looking through a telescope, and I kind of realized I would never know much of anything at all. And I've always been very content with that. I mean, I have spent my whole life reading books and thinking and doing research and teaching and so on. So what I chase is knowledge, and yet I went into that at the age of 7 or 8 with the understanding that although I wanted knowledge, I would never really have very much of it. To me, looking through a telescope, I remember when I first saw the Andromeda Galaxy, to me it was just like that was a real wake-up call. First time I ever saw another galaxy through a telescope. I just had this really shock of recognition that my lot is ignorance, right? But in a way, I think that maybe that kind of liberates me from the intense quest for knowledge because I just do it because it's fun, I can't give you a really grand or proper or ethical reason for why I enjoy studying so much. It's just, that's what I do. But I've also realized a long time ago that, the amount of knowledge that I can get in this domain of existence that we're in is just not even a hair's breadth, compared to what there is.
I think it's, what is it, Socrates said, the only thing that I know is that I know nothing. I that was him.
That's right.
And I tend to latch on to that because if I think I know it all, then I miss something.
Yeah, that really must be a very, very unpleasant situation inwardly, people who think they know. Like I noticed the fundamentalists, and, the ones that I get most gaff from are the funda-Christians, as I call them. But once you use that word fundamentalist, it doesn't matter a hill of beans what follows the modifier, right? It's like Christian or Jewish, Muslim or Marxist, they're all the same people, right? I mean, if you ever think about it, like look at a Christian fundamentalist, get that picture in your mind. Then look at one of the mullahs, like or one of the Jewish fundamentalists or whatever, and get those pictures in your mind, and you see it's all the same person. Like, number one, they got the rigid body posture and that kind of like too scrubbed and cleaned look and like no sense of humor, right? And I've got the answers, and if you don't believe it, then you're going to hell. Or as the Marxists said, the dustbin of history. Well, I think it's so interesting that's really Marx used that same metaphor because the Sheol, the hell, that was the garbage pit, right? That was where the word came from. So really, it's all the same kind of people. It's like they think they got the answers. They're scared to death Because on the deep level, Jeremy, they know that they don't know any more about it than you and I do, right? I mean, you or I are in a situation where it's easy for us to say, I don't know. But there's some people who are just so terrified of this that they will, that they will in their minds consign 99% of the people they know to hell mentally because they, don't go along with some little tiny detail of the fundamentalist ideology. I mean, and I think that's a hilarious situation. I mean, if you saw it in a comedy, you would be laughing at it, but yeah.
A friend of mine, she helped me interview you last time, is that she and I believe we should actually write a movie called The Divine Comedy. And it's basically what's going on in our heads and what's coming, because, when you look at it from that perspective of the observer, I guess, and I watch things happening around me, and I laugh, but I'm not really laughing at them. I'm laughing at where I was at one time.
Exactly. You're so right, Jared. That's right. It's the best humor is always self-depreciating. Yes. It is. That's exactly right, because laughing at somebody that's just a terrible thing. But laughing with them is a great experience.
Yep. Yep.
Well, how old are you now, Jeremy?
I'm turning 41 on March 3rd.
41, okay, the midlife, I tell you, that's just so great. Well, it is, in the sense that, when I was 41, I was just hoping, how much longer do I have to live? I want to get out of here. Because that what happens is that, and this is Raymond Moody speaking, but I am a psychiatrist, so I have some basis to make this judgment, but it's just my observation. And that is that I've noticed that all the people who used to come to me and during their midlife crisis, and then I got better at that after my own because, then I saw what it was all about. But people with a midlife crisis, if you interview them, it's almost all of them that I ever had who were having a midlife crisis were the good kids in high school, right? It's like they never rebelled, right? And I never did. All the way yes, sir, yes, ma'am, never rebelled. But then when I got 38, and so if you don't rebel, if you're not like an average cranky and irascible adolescent, and you sort of put on a smiling face and tiptoe and say, yes, ma'am, or, and so on all the way through. Then when you get 38, that comes back because adolescence is something you have to go through. And if you don't when you're 17 or whatever, 18, 16, then you're going to do it when you're 38. It's just, yeah.
It's interesting you should say that, is that I actually... Through my teens, I was the good kid, and then about 20, 21, I started getting into a lot of partying, and the people that listen to my show know that I went into a lot of drug use and stuff like that, and had a sex and drug addiction, and it wasn't until my 30s that I started to recognize that. And I honestly now, hitting 41, I'm feeling pretty great at 41. I'm sure that,
we'll terrific. That's great. So you got your rebellion out of the way early. That's good.
I got it all out of the way. So it was very cool to experience. And it's interesting because I'm actually thinking about one of the questions I was going to ask you about near-death experience, or just in this realm, I guess, is I interviewed a man last year. I think actually you know him. His name is Don Oscar Miro Casada.
Oscar.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
His two experiences, they seem to be different. The first time when he was young, he had a light being come and touch his chest, and then the second one was, I don't know if you know the story, but he was racing his car, and he was mad at God and everything, and he went off of a cliff, and a man came in a leather jacket and said, we're going to assess whether you're going back or not. And in that sense, my mother had an angel come to her and say, "You're going to go back." But he didn't see the light at the tunnel. He didn't see any tunnel. These were obvious experiences with beings or spirits or energies or whatever we would want to refer to them as. And I mean, are the experiences consistent, or are there variations on most of them, or do they kind of go into categories? Or is it something we can categorize?
They do go into categories. The way I look at it is, let's say you have 1,000 cases you've done and you've looked at. What you're going to find is that the overwhelming majority of them, you can pretty much get a map on it by taking 15 common elements, right, including like hearing this noise like a wah, 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 wah. Getting out of your body, hearing the doctor say you're dead, becoming aware of a passageway that you go through into a light, entering into a state where you just have no words to describe it, but it's beyond description, seeing your life in review, meeting your dead relatives, maybe seeing a whole civilization which seems to be made of light, and so on, and other things. And then what happens, if you take that 1,000 people, then you'll find that some of them, like maybe they just remember 2 or 3 of these things in their experience, and others may remember 4 or 5 or 6, and yet others, 7 or 8 or 9, and some 13 and 14, and some maybe have the whole full-blown picture. They see all the 15 things. And what it seems to correlate very well with is how close that person got to death. Like, if they just had, say, a momentary cardiac arrest, they may tell you, oh, yeah, I got out of my body, I began to see this tunnel and a light, and then I came back. If they have a cardiac arrest that goes on 10 minutes, they're more likely to say, yeah, I got out of my body, I went through this tunnel into this light, I talked with my relatives, I saw my life in review, and so on. And so that's the way it works. It seems that the closer somebody gets to death, the more of this experience that unfolds for them. And having said that, I immediately got to backtrack to this degree and say, at other times I've had patients who had practically no injury at all, and yet nonetheless had a very, full-blown experience. So, yeah, not every one of them is identically the same. But if you look at, say, 1,000 of them, you'll definitely see those patterns that, that appear in the big picture.
Interesting. I've actually found that in regression work with past life regressions. I've found that the archetypal pattern, I guess is the best word to put it, is that there's the similar story, not the imagery, but the similar story, the internal story that's going on, is the same in each one of their experiences leading up into this. And some people call that karma. I call it something going on here energetically or mind-wise, that when they fix it, then it all clears. And kind of just related in some way, but it's just
that's really interesting, Gerald. Yeah, what you're hitting on there is something it's been on my mind a lot. See, because until I had this experience about 3 years ago, where I kind of woke up to, oh my goodness, there's something going on here that I don't really get. I mean, I always was in that situation, but I just didn't know. But about 3 years ago at this thing, and then there were others like that as well, but I started thinking, well, oh my God, this seems to be real, which I'd been putting off to make any sort of assessment. And what happened to me when it sort of dawned on me that, to my utter astonishment, and that, which is still very counterintuitive to me, that there could be an afterlife, because William James, the psychologist, said one time that the ideas that you're exposed to when you're a kid they are really sort of embedded in you in a very deep way, and it's hard to overcome them. And so since I just grew up with the idea of an afterlife not even being vaguely in a picture for me, this is still here at age 70 very difficult for me to come to terms with. But I have been forced into it. I mean, what am I going to say when the doctor and the nurse talk to the dead wife of the patient who they were trying to repair and resuscitate? See what I'm talking about? I mean, I could say, sure, the doctor and nurse were having a collective psychotic episode while the patient was having a near-death experience from whatever reason. But that doesn't feel right to me. You know what I'm talking about? It's I just seem to be in a situation where I could feel myself trying to escape and rationalize rather than just to say what seems to be under these circumstances, the most plausible thing to say is that, oh my God, there does seem to be something after death. But that still shocks me as I say it. Now, in that process, though, Jeremy, I had to come to think, well, then, all right, then what is this all about, right? I mean, I never really faced that before. It's like, okay, there's a life after death, but then what is this? And that quest sort of put me on the same path that you just sort of came up with there, which is that I have to go back to Aeschylus and Euripides and Sophocles. See, my heroes are the ancient Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, and what I have concluded, Elie Wiesel, the great thinker, Elie Wiesel said, God made man because he loves stories. And I'm thinking a lot about this. I mean, what is personal identity, right? Like, what is it that makes you the unique person you are? Well, philosophers have worked with that one for a long time. Plato said, for example, his idea was, well, what we really are is our soul, which is this immaterial conscious entity which inhabits the body. See, to Plato, the body was just an illusory kind of unreal thing, but the soul or that was the essence of the person. Well, that did pretty well for people through much of the Middle Ages, and it got into where the Christians took over the Platonic idea of the soul, and then they just said, well, if anybody thinks that this is not right, then they go to the stake or whatever, right? So you could deal with if you were Pope, once people got over here, then they got kind of out of control. But, in Europe, they were pretty much at the whim of the Pope as to the stake. But, so that worked pretty well. But then in the 16th century, or the 17th century, for example, Hobbes, began to be dubious about that. It's like the whole idea of an immaterial thing, like the soul, well, that was hard for him to swallow. But, he kind of doubted it. Then in the next 100 years or so, along came John Locke, who had a lot to do with our country and our way of thinking. And John Locke said, well, what constitutes our personal identity is our memories, right? But we know, too, now our memories are kind of shifty. What I think is, what a person's identity is that person's story. What else is it? And I think from that point of view, I've reached the point in my thinking that David Hume had finally reached, and he said that the only kind of afterlife that a rational person can entertain is reincarnation. And I've sort of come to that myself. Because, this is stories, right? And what is it that you get from your clients? You get a story, right? Because that is the life they led. So, and I heard it from my kids, too. It's very interesting. I gather I probably did hear it from my grown ones, who are now 43 or 40, but I wasn't sort of open to hearing it then. But I just hear people all the time, and incidentally, our friends are not people who are interested in this kind of thing. You know, I mean, we hang out with, well, there's our electrician who's our friend, and not just all our friends about here. It's not, we don't talk about life after death or New Age things. We talk about how we're going to pay the phone bill, what's for dinner, what's on at the movies this weekend. Carol Ann's having this trouble with homework and so that's what we talk about. Plus, we don't take these kids to any sort of religious ceremonies. I mean, we live in Alabama, and we are afraid of snakes. That's a joke. And and the kids actually learned fairly recently that about my Life After Death book because they found out about it on the internet. See, this is not what we talk about. But both of my kids who were adopted at birth, Carter is 16. He was adopted at birth from Kerrville, Texas. He is Mexican-American by heritage. Carol Ann is now 14, and she is a Blackfeet Indian from Montana. We adopted her at birth, and we never talked to them about the afterlife. But both of them, Jeremy, have related independently, like very clear and vivid memories of how they chose to come to us. And, you know, it came so much out of the blue. And in one case, along with some just absolutely details that make your hair stand up on end. But basically, it's my son Carter, who is 16 now. At 5, we were watching TV and we were flipping through the channels. And when I flipped through what turned out to be the National Geographic Channel, just real fast, but when I did, Carter got very animated and he said, Dad, that's my village. And I said, huh? So I turned it back, and it was a documentary about Chinese village life. And then and I was just, I mean, you know, what is this? I'm hearing this from my kid. And he said, yeah, you remember, like, before I came to you and Mommy, I was with my mom and dad in China with my brothers and sisters. And then he went on. And then he could tell that it wasn't computing with me. And he said, oh, well, and he said, and then I was up in the trees looking down at you and Mommy lying in the grass. And I knew exactly what he meant because before he came to us, we were in Greece. We're just traveling around, my wife and I, and we were just exhausted from the trip. And we were at this archaeological site, and the attendant, who was this very perceptive man, just looked at us and he said, oh, you two go over there and lie down in the grass and just take a little nap. And so we did, and what we were talking about was adopting a child. And those trees were all around us, I remember, and then, you know, some years later, to get my attention, Carter says, oh, yeah, and then I was up in the trees looking at you and Mom lying in the grass. And then my little Blackfeet daughter, about 4 years ago, came up with the same thing just out of nowhere. Started talking about, I was with God and he pointed you out to me, she said. And she said, you got to go down to be his daughter. And I said, well, how did you feel about that? And she said, oh, I didn't want to do it. But he pushed me, she said, to down to be your daughter. So, yeah, I mean, life is narrative. And I gather, you know, that we go through one of these stories and then we go through some sort of incomprehensible process that you probably can figure out more about that than I have, or have probably some better idea of it. But, you know, we go through this process and then we're back here again, like my daughter told me, going through another story.
Yeah. It's interesting you should bring that up because about a month after I saw your lecture, I went to a shamanic workshop, and the shaman teacher said this. She said, a shaman is the master storyteller. They are the ones that have mastered their
that's right. That was originally the function. That's right. Yeah.
And I thought, my jaw dropped because I was like, that is so these ancient enlightened ones or these ancient philosophers, or they they understood that this is a story, and we're living in this story, or I think I've heard some people say a paradigm. We're living in this paradigm, and whatever that is what makes it.
Yeah, we are. This is narrative. It really is. Have you heard of that case of Mary Neal, the orthopedic surgeon from Wyoming, I think it is?
Yes, I have.
Yeah,
I've actually talked to her an email about coming on the show.
Yeah. That one, to me, shows this dramatic thing very well because, in her case, her husband is also an orthopedic surgeon, and they were down in Peru whitewater canoeing, and her canoe turned over and got wedged against a rock, and she was upside down in the rushing cold water for a long period of time, out of her body, just kind of wondering what was going to happen to the situation. And all the rescuers were there trying desperately to turn over her canoe to get her out, and just went on and on and on and unsuccessfully. And all of the rescuers agreed that suddenly, just out of nowhere, this rock that had not been there before just kind of rose up from under the water, and they were able to, anchor themselves on that and pull the canoe over. Well, to me that just means that God, in order to make the plot come out right, will even, change the stage scenery around to make it right.
That's really actually pretty. Yeah, I remember her story. That was all over the news when that happened. I think it came out just before Evan experience, if I remember right, or it was right around the same time.
That's right. See, this is one of the things that's happening with this whole NDE thing. It's like now most of them you're hearing from who've had this experience are doctors. And this whole series of articles in Missouri Medicine is written by doctors who've had them or who have investigated them. And it's just, I've reached this point, too, is thinking about, it's like I have all these medical colleagues who have had near-death experiences who tell me, yeah, this was real. I went to the other side, it's real. And see, I'm in a situation where I think, well, if heaven forbid I had to go to a doctor, which I hate to do, I mean, doctors by and large don't like to go to doctors because, you've seen it from the other side and I don't want any of that. And I'm one of those, I just hate to go to the doctor. But I asked myself, if I had to go to the doctor, would I go to these doctors that I know who've had near-death experiences and have told me, yeah, I got out of my body, this is real and so on? And in every case, they say, yeah, I would. So, what wouldn't there be something wrong with me if I say, well, their medical judgment is such, I'd put my life in their hands, terribly to think, if I had to do it. But that I don't trust them on what they all say, the same thing about what they experience, that as wacky as it sounds, that it's real. So, see, that's part of my process, too. I just, what do? Are you just going to contradict your friends to their face? No. It's like, well, that was just your brain acting up, Evan, or, you're the neurosurgeon here, I'm telling you that this was your brain. It just eventually you get into a very paradoxical situation when you try to think about it that way.
Yeah, I think in some ways if we just relax into it and understand it and research it and ponder it, and then we're constantly growing and learning. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it does.
That's my attitude too. I mean, it's to me, it's everything is okay. I mean, this is it was a hard process for me to come to realize that, and it's still counterintuitive to me, I must say. But apparently, when you die, there's this opening up into some other kind of level or state of reality. I heard one of the doctors who had this experience tell me it's like they suddenly found themselves in this more inclusive state of reality. And, I'm beginning to wake up to that myself. There's a there's a more complex reality kind of over the top of this one. I think almost this is some kind of movie projected here from another world. I had sort of figured that one out for myself, and I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't talk about this. That I'm beginning to get the idea that this is some kind of holographic movie that's projected before us. And I thought, well, I just chuckled to myself, well, I think that's what it is, but I better not say that. Then a couple of months later, I picked up the Scientific American, and it said, are we living in a holographic projection from another universe? And the article kind of concluded that, yeah, we are. So I had reached pretty much that same understanding of it myself through a different set of, through a different process.
Yeah, there's Amit Goswami and all them. They're starting to talk about quantum physics and the illusion that we live in. And
that's
so
right. It's like people who are trying to figure out quantum mechanics are in the same situation as people, just somewhat similar situation as people who are trying to figure out about life after death. And namely, is that you can't really get much ahead of the problem or get much inroads on it as long as you're using Aristotelian logic. It's because Aristotelian logic, which we use in everyday life, is a binary code, right? Like true or false, and it's predicated on literal meaning. But you can't really put that kind of logic to use much when you split a particle in half and both the two halves go off at the speed of light in opposite directions, and then you do something to one of them, and then the other one immediately conforms. That's not something you can figure out using a binary code. It's what the quantum physicists, they say, is that they need a three-valued logic. And that's right. And see, the third value is unintelligible. It's like it's like the statement, there is a desk in your office is probably true, right? But the statement that there is a kangaroo in your office is probably wrong, or so probably false. But when somebody says, well, holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity, we can't handle that one using true or false. We got to get some distance on the problem, and that's what. And what I'm saying is that problem is now solved. We do have now entirely new ways to think logically about things that are unintelligible. So that gives me my optimism that we are closing in on the afterlife problem.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, we just have another minute or so, and I just wanted to make sure everybody gets your website. It's www.lifeafterlife.com. I actually noticed on there that you and Evan are doing, is it a lecture that you go to Amazon on, or is it, I noticed on your website something with Evan Alexander. I didn't know if I got that right.
Oh, yeah, that we did this video together some years ago. That's probably the one you saw. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so I would, if whoever's listening, I would definitely check that out and check out Dr. Moody's website. And Dr. Moody, has been a pleasure having you on the show again, and look forward to
likewise, Jeremy. It's just where are you coming from?
I live in St. Petersburg, Florida.
Okay, so that you live down there. Okay, great. I didn't know.
Matter of fact,
seemed like I was thinking you were just there as a. Okay, great, St. Petersburg, great.
And your wife is from this area too, isn't she? She's from the campus.
She is. She was at WTOG or whatever it is, Channel 44 for 10 years.
Yeah, I remember her being on the news when I read that in your book. I know her. So, well, thank you so much for being on the show, and you have a wonderful.
Thank you, Jeremy. Looking forward to seeing you again too. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.